We are now ready to begin the third and final theme of this course, which is about governance. Who decides what schools are, who should run them, and what should be happening within the walls? There are a lot of decisions today that are made by local, state, and federal governments, and they have far-reaching effects on how we teach, what you teach, how schools operate, accountability practices, assessments that'll be given to the students, documentation for almost everything that happens within that school, all of which not only ultimately affect your pedagogy, but they also affect the way students learn. Think about the historical readings from the very first theme during those 2 weeks, and think about the writings of those early educators, and think about the changes that are happening today in education. How is education still similar to the posits that were made by those early writers? And how do you see that education has and is changing? Are there still some similarities to what they defined as education and public education? Or have we come so far away from that you don't see any similarities to that anymore? So think about that as you begin to read the issues involved in this theme. We'll be reading the issues asking us, should public schooling be redefined? Does class size affect student achievement? Does funding improve student achievement? And the whole idea of whether charter schools should be expanded or not. There are those who posit that the whole idea of public schooling needs to be redefined. And they want to change the definition about what constitutes public in public schooling, and may change what should be included in the idea of public education. What do you think? What can you accept from what these authors are saying, and what do you reject? Looking at the conclusions that they come to, are there some things from their conclusions and suggestions that you can accept, but not necessarily their arguments? Or are there parts of the argument you can accept, but not their solutions? Think about that as you're reading these articles, particularly about the article about the redefinition of a public school. Part of the argument centers on the role of charter schools. So in the additional sources, you're going to find some research that talks about the effectiveness of charter schools. And so think about what that evidence tells you, but then also think about the literature that informs you about how charter schools affect funding of traditional schools, that talk about the effectiveness of charter schools in improving student achievement. And are there some positive ways that they affect student achievement? If so, what are they? And as you're reading about the redefinition of public schools and about charter schools, think deeply about the arguments and posits of these writers and about the research. Do you see any compromises that can be made between charter schools, private schools, homeschooling, vouchers, and traditional public schools? Is there a way that those entities can compromise and perhaps complement one another to improve student achievement? How might that happen? And then how might that affect the the funding for traditional public schools? Unfortunately, conventional wisdom plays a role in policy and decision making. In his book, The World is Flat, Thomas Friedman talks about conventional wisdom, and he says that conventional wisdom is based on long held beliefs that are based basically on hearsay or statements such as, well, it just makes sense, or it's always been that way, but it's not based on evidence. I want you to think about some of the things that your mom or maybe your grandma told you. Like one that I remember particularly is, don't go outside with a wet head because you'll catch a cold. That's conventional wisdom. Well, there are instances of conventional wisdom that continue to affect public policies and public decision making. But the time for that has to stop, because we've made too many mistakes in education trying to use conventional wisdom rather than digging in and finding out what the real evidence says. Some examples of that: how often have you heard, or maybe have you said, well, if we only had more funding, ... or if we just had smaller class sizes, ... But what does the evidence support? And what can you do to combine the evidence that you find in the readings from the Kuntz text and the evidence that you find from the additional sources? How can you marry that into a position or a thesis that you can support that would then influence decision making? If funding and class size don't have long-term positive effects on student achievement, then what does the evidence say does? What are the factors that do have long-term effects on student achievement, and how would you couple that information, those factors, with the evidence about class size and or funding? Funding seems to be a battle that is fought year after year, and it also creates battles at a local level. There are those who support increased funding for schools and those who are vehemently against it. How can you move away from the conventional wisdom and use what you have found out as you read and study these issues and the additional information? How can you inject evidence that will insert a more researched way to make decisions rather than decisions and or arguments based on conventional wisdom? Arm yourself with the knowledge from the research, and then you can carefully construct your thesis and recommendations, and you can really influence some meaningful decisions and insert them perhaps at board meetings, meeting with administrative teams, but providing that knowledge base that people need to make a better choice or better decision. When you think about decision making and you think about the different levels, the decisions made about education on the federal level, state level, and the local level, what's your feeling about that? Do you think that those decisions are pretty well balanced, or do you think they're skewed more heavily toward one of those entities? And then lastly, I want you to think about how would you suggest a better balance? If you thought about the kind of balance related to class size, funding, charter schools, vouchers, the definition of public schooling, how would you see that balance playing out? What structure would you suggest that would best support teachers teaching and students learning? If you could redesign it, what would it look like? So keep these considerations in mind as you read through the articles and the additional sources as well. By this time, you have viewed all of the PowerPoints that relate to the Lit Review text. And so your discussion of these issues and the additional sources should take on an appearance of a good discussion in a literature review. You should be able to move fluidly between articles and between topics so that at the end you can present a solid, well-supported thesis of your own with then suggestions for future questions or for future actions. So this is your chance to take a look at that governance balance and decide what kinds of influence you can interject into that balance to influence how teachers teach, how schools run, and how students learn. Enjoy this challenge.